Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and what is going to be a new video series on my channel. If you have been watching my channel, you may have noticed that over the last few years I have posted quite a few videos where I play synthesizers and I experiment and I improvise, and I'm doing quite sort of experimental music, sometimes noise music. It just depends where the improvisation and my inspiration takes me. And one of the most heavily featured synthesizers in that genre is the Kilpatrick Audio Phenol. So this is a synth that was crowdfunded a few years ago, and it is meant to be a reasonable entry into the world of modular synthesis. And I call this a modular synthesizer, and some of you may think that it isn't because the modules are not separate and possible to move around or swap out in a rack. But there are two ways to look at modular synthesis, and one is the Eurorack format, where you have all these physical modules that you can buy and you can add to your system and you can put them in the rack yourself the way you want them. And the second way to look at modular is that you have modules, but they are in a single unit like this. So this is a module, this is an oscillator module here, an oscillator module there, filter module, and these modules are completely separate. There are no connections made between them, and the main difference is they are now in a single chassis and they are on the same circuit board. And this of course makes it a lot cheaper. So this, if you wanted to get separate single module synthesizer like this, it would cost probably twice as much. But I'll still call it modular, perhaps even patchable is a better term, but modular because there is something called a semi-modular, and this looks like a semi-modular synthesizer, like the Mother 32, for instance, the Neutron, things like that. But the main difference isn't that the modules can be swapped out or moved around. The main difference is that in a semi-modular, the connections are already made. So you have an oscillator that is pre-patched to the filter, then to the VCA, and then to the output. And you don't have to attach any cables to change that. But on a modular synthesizer like this, there are no connections between the modules. The only thing they share is a ground connection, and then everything else has to be patched up. So, and one of the reasons that this is different is, well, it's not the reason, but it's one of the things that make it different, is that you have banana jacks instead of what is probably the most common these days, which is the Eurorack 3.5mm plug. So this is a Eurorack plug here, and this is a banana jack. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference there. So the Phenol and also systems like Buchla and Sage, they use banana jacks. And also if you are using any kind of electronic test equipment, you will be familiar with these. The banana jack has a single line going through it. So all of this connector here connects to all of this connector here. So when you patch it up, it creates a single line of connection through here from one to the other. Whereas on a Eurorack, this is the same as a mono audio plug, really. It has two poles, so the tip and the sleeve. The tip is the signal and the sleeve is ground. So when you plug in a Eurorack cable, you are in essence actually creating two connections between one thing and another. You're connecting the signal and you're connecting the ground as well. So that is one main difference here. So because this is banana jack modular, all the grounds of these modules have already been connected together, and those grounds are then connected to the ground connectors on the line outputs, the line inputs, and also there is a ground banana jack socket back here as well for connecting this to other equipment, because you need your grounds to be connected together when you are, if you patch it with other equipment than this unit. But at the moment, all the grounds here are connected together. One advantage, of course, with using the Eurorack standard is that a mini jack socket can also be a switch. So if you imagine that you have a semi-modular synthesizer with Eurorack sockets, when you plug something into the output of the oscillator, that breaks the connection. It triggers the switch that breaks the connection that is pre-patched, which is, for instance, to the filter. So if, without plugging anything in, the oscillator goes to the filter, once you plug something in here, that connection is broken, and then you can plug this in somewhere else. It doesn't have to be the filter anymore. It could be the synchronized oscillator input of oscillator 2, for instance. So that's an advantage. A disadvantage with the Eurorack format is that because these have 2 poles, when you plug it in, or when you want to plug something in, the first thing that happens as you touch the socket with the plug is that the tip shorts to the connector for the sleeve. So if you're doing it just like that and you're sort of doing it slowly, your signal shorts to ground before it connects to signal again, which means if you're not doing it quickly and decisively, you can get little audio glitches. Whereas on the banana jack, once you touch the socket, that's it. That connection is already made even before you plug it in properly. So those are a few differences. The banana jacks are also quite solid and durable, and also they're easier to make stackable. So it is possible to make stackable cables in Eurorack format, but of course it is more complicated because you need good connections between all the ground connectors, and you need good connections between all the signal connectors. But banana jack, because it is so simple, you can stack them very easily because it's a single signal pole going through, and you can stack them as high as you want, really, although sometimes that's not a good idea for other reasons. It depends what kind of total signal strength you are working with. So banana jacks, that is banana jacks versus Eurorack cables. Another thing about modular, and of course this isn't true for all modular synthesis or semi-modular synthesis, is that you can treat an audio signal as a control signal. And what I mean by that is that you have, in lots of synthesizers, you distinguish between control values, also known as CV, and audio signals. And sometimes they use different signal levels as well, but in a modular system like this, you can treat them the same way. So, for instance, I can take the signal output from my LFO here, like this, and I can just plug it into the audio output, and I will get audio. And likewise, I can take the output from an oscillator now, and I can use it as a control signal to control the pitch or the frequency modulation or the pulse width modulation of another oscillator. So the thing is that you can just cross modulate however you like, really, within reason, on a modular, because there is no difference between audio signals and control signals. And this is a huge flexibility that makes it quite interesting as well. And these are some of the things that I do when I play experimentally with a modular synthesizer like this one, is to use audio signals as control signals and vice versa as well. So let's go and do a quick overview now of the modules here. I'm not going to go too deep in depth because I will reserve that for later videos. But let's start with the most basic ones, and that is the oscillators. So we have two identical oscillators up here in the upper left and the middle left here. And they have frequency modulation input. They have pitch input, so these are control value inputs, but of course you can use audio signals as control value as well. They have a coarse tuning knob, a fine tune knob. They have pulse width modulation input and a pulse width modulation level and an FM level as well. So these two knobs here, they control how much these inputs are, how strong these inputs are going to, so they attenuate these inputs really. So if they're at full, like so, then you get the full value of the inputs, and anything less, they will reduce the strength of the signal coming into these inputs. There is also a pulse width, I should say, pulse width control here. So that's your pulse width setting, and this of course is only used for the pulse output. And there's a sync input as well, which oscillator sync, which means that it will sync to a signal. So every time it gets a synchronized, a certain level of voltage on the sync input, it will restart the waveform of the oscillator. It can create quite some interesting effects. I haven't played too much around with that, but I will demonstrate that in some later video. The outputs from the oscillator here are external input 1, so that is an external audio input at the back here that is routed through the external input here. There's a triangle wave, a ramp, so that's like a sawtooth style wave, and a pulse wave. So these are three different waveforms, and an interesting thing about this synthesizer compared to many others is that these waveforms are not selectable. That is to say, you don't have a switch that selects between them. You can use all of them at the same time, which is very interesting as well. And both of these oscillators are identical. Then you have two complex envelopes, and these can be a little bit tricky to wrap your head around because they are digital envelopes. And because normally you have an envelope is to affect the most common way to use an envelope is to control a VCA, an amplifier, by telling the amplifier how long from a zero signal level to full signal level, that's the attack, and how long from maximum signal level to the sort of level point that it maintains, that is the decay. Then it's a sustain part, which is when it just stays flat as long as it is told to keep playing. And then there is a release, which is how long it takes for the signal to go from the sustain level and back to zero. That's what you normally get on most synthesizers, certainly on the classical ones. These ones, however, are a bit different. They can be normal ADSR envelopes, but they can also do many other things. They can also work as LFOs, low frequency oscillators, to modulate signals, and they can do other stuff as well. I'm not going to go into detail with those. That's going to be a long episode some other time. Then we have filters. We have two different filters. There's a low pass filter and a band pass filter. A low pass filter has a frequency knob here, which also has is controlled by control voltage if you want to. That is the FM input, and that sets a frequency threshold above which all the signal is attenuated. So above a certain frequency, the signal will start to taper off until it goes down to zero. So when it's at the bottom, it will be a really deep sound, and all the high frequencies are gone. And as you move it higher, you get more and more of the spectrum included. A bandpass is similar, but instead of cutting off frequencies above a certain threshold, it will cut off frequencies away from the threshold. So if you set this to 200 Hertz, for instance, then of course both above and below 200 Hertz will start to taper off and get attenuated. And they also have a resonance input. Resonance means that you add a little bit of amplification at the cutoff point. So at the cutoff point, if you put that on the band pass here for 200 Hertz, then if you have any frequencies of 200 Hertz exactly, they will get amplified the most when you use the resonance knob, like so. And then you have the VCAs, 2 of them, and that is voltage controlled amplifier, or in many ways I think that in this synthesizer they are technically attenuators, and they let all the signal through if you put the amp at the top, and as you move it down, or as you use CV to control how much amplification is, it will reduce the signal levels accordingly. So if you don't use the VCAs and you take the signal straight from the oscillator, it's going to be full strength. So the VCAs are technically not VCAs, they don't amplify, they actually just attenuate. But that's, the principle is the same. This is something you can take the signal through to change the amplitude, that is the volume, the signal level of something. And of course you can use this both for audio and you can use it for control values as well. So you could imagine taking something from an LFO through the VCA and then take the output somewhere else, for instance. Then you have an LFO, a single LFO here, of course, but you can use the envelopes also as LFOs. Low frequency oscillator is a common way to affect other parameters in a synthesizer. And the main control is the speed. And you can see the lights here are actually changing to reflect the speed. The colors of the lights here indicate whether the value output is a positive or a negative voltage. The phenol is working on a bipolar voltage. That means it goes down to negative and it goes up to positive, and the center voltage is 0. Not all synths do that. A lot of synths operate at 0 to 5 volts or 0 to 10 volts. And this one is, the main range of this synth is -5 to +5, but of course it can also go up to 10 for the frequency of the oscillators, and it can tolerate up to 15 volts, I think, at the maximum as well, which takes it out of range a lot of the time. The LFO has 2 outputs, which also can be used at the same time. One is a random output and one is a sine wave output. Then we have an adder, which is an adder, attenuator and inverter in one. It has 2 input sockets, although of course you could stack inputs, but you can, just to make it tidier, there are 2. And then it has a negative output, which inverts the input values, and a positive output, which outputs the input values added together. These outputs will also attenuate the signal to make sure that it isn't going above the threshold for what signal strengths you can use in the modules. So if you have a really strong signal coming in and you're not sure you want to plug it into any of the other ones, especially from an external unit, if you plug them into the adder, you are sure that they will be reduced to levels that are manageable by the synthesizer. And also you get the inverted one. And this is, the level is the signal strength. So if it's at full, that means you get the full strength of the input signal. And if you reduce it, it is attenuated, lower and lower. Divider is an input here again. And of course, there's another thing here that I haven't mentioned. The white sockets are gate inputs. And that means that they respond to, once you get a voltage level, I think it is above 1 volt, they will register that a gate is triggered. So then they will be active once you get past 1 volt. And when that happens, they will, so the synchronized input will synchronize when it goes from below to above a gate. The same with the gate inputs here on the envelopes. And for the divider, when it then gets the gate input, it will advance its division. So it divides the signal. So you have, if you imagine that you're getting signal from the LFO here, and now it's about that kind of speed. And if you input that into the divider, let's just see what that looks like now. When it divides it, so every time it goes above a certain level, you get, every other time you get a gate, you get an out 2. Every 3 times you get a third. Every 4 times you get an output here, and every 6 times you get an output here. That's something that is quite useful for creating rhythmic effects, for instance. And then there is a MIDI to CV, so you have a MIDI input here, standard DIN MIDI, and it has a pitch output, modulator output, so that is your mod wheel CC1 MIDI output, gate output, and clock output as well. So those are the only ones you have. There is also you can also record MIDI, and once you've recorded MIDI, you can press play, and it will keep that MIDI signal that you have recorded will just keep going and going. You can unplug the MIDI here if you like, and it will just stay in the system until you switch it off, and when you switch it back on again, that memory will be cleared. So that's quite a useful feature as well. And then finally we have a mixer, which also has a digital delay attached to it. So you have 2 inputs. They don't have to be left and right. You can actually decide that for yourself with individual level controls. So again, full is full signal level, and if you reduce it, then I think this one actually amplifies a bit as well. It certainly feels like it. And then you have a pan control. So if you want your signal to be left and right, you can do it like so, pan hard left and hard right. And this one is then going to the master output again. And then you also have a delay, a digital delay, which is quite noisy, like a sort of a bucket brigade delay. And you can choose how much of the signal is delayed and what kind of delay time it is. So that is quite a nice little feature as well. It actually sounds quite good, and it has a sound that suits the general sound of the synthesizer. Right, I've been doing a lot of talking now, but I haven't actually shown you any sounds. So I'm just going to show you the basic sounds of the oscillators now. So I'm going to plug this into the triangle output, into the audio mixer input here, and we've got a nice triangle wave here. And you can do fine-tuning of the pitch, you can do coarse tuning. And as you can see, if I increase the levels a bit now, you can see the lines there is that it's a little bit curved. So it's not a perfectly... You can see it better now perhaps. So it's a curve and not a straight line, which is good. That means that it's not going to sound too digital. Let's look at the ramp. So this is our sort of sawtooth wave. Again, you can see the downward slope there is a bit curved, and also you have these little points at the bottom and top where it gets a little bit sort of ragged, which is also another thing that you see with analog synthesizers. And finally we have the pulse, which is a square wave. And again you have nice curves here. Also let's do the pulse width. So we have pulse width all the way to the left. Pulse width all the way to the right. That's what the basic waveforms look like. And I think that's enough for today. I'm going to get back to the waveforms. I'm going to talk more about oscillators, and I'm going to go through all the different modules as well. Just enough, I think, to get you started. So that's just an introduction now, I think, to this video series. And I will add more later. I will talk more about oscillators next time, and also I'm going to show the different modulations as well. Just thought I'd show you the basic sounds right away. So I hope you enjoyed watching this, and I'm going to tell you more about the synthesizer and synthesis in general next time. Thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.